Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, depending upon where you're watching from or listening from. I'm Janice Kaminer-Resnick, and I welcome you on behalf of the members of our leadership team, former Congressman Mel Levine and former LA County Supervisor Zev Yaroslavsky. Thank you and welcome to our guests, two of the country's foremost experts on laws impacting reproductive and women's rights, legal and Supreme Court journalist Dahlia Lithwick of Slate, Newsweek, and MSNBC, and legal scholar and author Mary Ziegler of the UC Davis School of Law. We are so honored to have you both with us, and of course, welcome and thanks to tonight's wonderful moderator, Madeleine Brand. Consistent with the feelings and requests of our audience from a poll we took recently, starting next week, almost every week between now and elections, we are going to be holding 2 programs each week. Next week on Monday, we'll be hearing about all things election, first from the Atlantic's David Frum on Monday, and then on Wednesday, we will welcome the former Illinois Congressman Adam Kinzinger, one of the 2 Republican members of the House Committee on the January 6th attack. And the following week on Monday, we'll host Ambassador Dennis Ross for an update on the very dynamic and scary situation in the Middle East. And then on Wednesday, we'll hear from the former chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mike Mullen. So for now, be marking off Mondays and Wednesdays from 5 to 6. We hope that you'll join us. As I said last week, doubling the program takes double the funds, so your generous contributions are most welcome. You can look inside of our emails for easy ways to donate. And I just want to thank you all who have donated, so many of you. It helps sustain our programming. The only thing we use these funds for are these programs. The links for the next 6 or 7 programs is in the email you'll get right after tonight's program. I just want to remind you, all of our programs are available via podcast and via our YouTube channel and on our website, and links to all of that is in every single email you get from us. And you can always go to chooseunitedfordemocracy.org if you get lost, or send me an email. You get lots of emails from me. All you have to do is reply to one. We encourage you to send our links and our emails to your friends, especially as the November election nears. The more people who can be educated by these incredible people on these important topics, the more favorable it will be for our democracy. And you can ask your friends to register for whichever programs interest them. Now to introduce tonight's guests and to engage in what I know will be a very important discussion, please welcome the extraordinary Madeleine Brand. Madeleine is the host of the award-winning daily news and culture show, Press Play, which airs on NBC's LA affiliate, KCRW. Madeleine has hosted and reported for NPR and for affiliate stations for more than 30 years. She has her graduate degree from Columbia School of Journalism, where she also taught documentary radio. She is a real pro, and we're very lucky to have her tonight and always. Now, Madeleine, it's yours.
Thank you so much, Janice. Great to be with you again, and great to have a womanal. So all women. This is maybe a first. I don't know. It's very exciting. So, and also I'm very happy to have 2 extremely intelligent and dynamic guests, both of whom I've interviewed on my show numerous times. Dahlia Lithwick is senior editor at Slate, where she writes their Supreme Court dispatches and jurisprudence columns. She also hosts Amicus, so go download that. It's Slate's award-winning biweekly podcast about the law and the Supreme Court. She earned her BA in English at Yale and her JD at Stanford, and has held visiting faculty positions at numerous universities. Her recent book, Lady Justice, Women, the Law, and the Battle to Save America, was a New York Times bestseller. She has appeared on CNN, ABC, The Colbert Report, The Daily Show. She's on The Rachel Maddow Show frequently. Of course, she's been on my show frequently. Hi, Dahlia.
Hey, Madeleine, it's great to be with you.
So good to have you back. And Mary Ziegler also appears frequently in national media, and she graduated cum laude from Harvard Law, magna cum laude from Harvard College, where she studied English and American literature. She is currently at UC Davis, where she is the Martin Luther King Jr. Professor of Law. She's a Guggenheim Fellow and one of the world's leading historians of the U.S. abortion debate. She's the author of half a dozen books on the law, history, and politics of abortion, including the most recent, Roe, The History of a National Obsession. Mary, welcome to you.
Thank you for having me.
Great to have you back. All right, let us begin, of course, with politics and the presidential campaign. Joe Biden, abortion rights, pro-choice, but not something he really liked to talk about much. He was a little uncomfortable about it as a Catholic and personally opposed to it. And then he said that weird thing in the debate about women being raped by their brothers and sisters, and he didn't really push back on Donald Trump, who said that babies were being aborted after they were born, et cetera, et cetera. So how do you see Kamala Harris, who had been previously, before she was vaulted to the top position, campaigning on this issue for President Biden, how do you see her as engaging on this issue differently? And how is her manner and the way that she is campaigning on abortion rights energizing voters, if it is indeed doing that? And let's begin with you, Dahlia.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. Thank you to Janice for wrangling this. It's always a pleasure to be with you, and just a thrill to be with both Madeleine and Mary. I think that the short answer is that this is just an area that President Biden has always been incredibly uncomfortable and awkward around. I think that a lot of women, and particularly people in the reproductive rights space, have been just aggravated that he can't even say the word abortion comfortably. It's taken him an incredibly long time, as you said, to kind of articulate a position on this, and certainly has never, even at peak engagement on this issue, been a real zealous advocate for it. I think that and we'll probably talk about this generally with respect to him and the court. He's just an institutionalist, and so he has not been able to frame this both as a sort of women's rights, dignity, autonomy issue, or to be able to frame it as the sort of place from which to go about criticizing the court. And so I think Vice President Harris comes with a huge advantage, first and foremost, that she is a woman, that she's thought about this. I covered her for years, as did you, Madeleine, on the Judiciary Committee, where she is just a fiery, fiery advocate for women's rights and women's bodies and their autonomy. The way it has worked thus far is that they've kind of farmed this issue out to Kamala Harris and let her be the voice of this. And so in some sense, it's incredibly fortuitous that now she can take center stage and make this a cornerstone of the campaign. And let's also be clear, I think that her new vice presidential pick has also been, at a state level, a really robust voice for abortion access, and for, famously says that he used IVF in order to have a child. And so I think that you are going to see a sort of a big generational shift in terms of a kind of sense that this is a hinky topic, and Biden didn't really feel comfortable deeply engaging to these sort of Gen X candidates who are very, very willing, clearly, to engage deeply. And so I think you're going to see a big, big change, not just centering reproductive rights generally, but centering the court itself and what the court has done in Dobbs in a way that we haven't really had a full-throated embrace.
Mary, how do you see it playing out amongst voters? Do you think voters, I mean, we've looked at previous elections, the midterm election, this was a big issue and it did it really well for the Democrats. Do you expect that to happen this time around as well?
I do. I mean, I think that one of the things that I'm hoping the Harris-Walz ticket can improve on is making the case to voters that this issue can actually still change their lives. Like, I can't tell you the number of times I get calls from reporters saying, well, I'm reporting from Michigan, Arizona, Pennsylvania, like places that either already have a ballot initiative protecting reproductive rights, or will have a ballot initiative protecting reproductive rights, or have a state Supreme Court that's protected reproductive rights. And essentially the takeaway is, well, I don't really like Trump's position on reproductive rights, but who cares, because he's not going to do anything, and he couldn't do anything because he would require Congress to intervene. And so I think the what I'm hoping is that Harris and Walz can not just inject this new energy that comes from being comfortable about talking about these issues in ways that resonate with people who are of reproductive age, but also that they can make the case that this is an issue that is actually going to be consequential when it comes to who's in the White House. It's not just sort of like, okay, well, we're mad at Donald Trump because Dobbs happened and there are Trump abortion bans, or, you know, we think Trump theoretically would sign this abortion ban that Congress might pass, which of course seems, you know, even in the event of Republicans controlling Congress, whenever people tell me Congress is going to do things, I'm very skeptical. Like, unless the things are, you know, dethroning Kevin McCarthy or the endless successors to Kevin McCarthy. Like, other than that, I'm not really a believer that Congress is doing things. So I think having an account of how people who care about this issue could be really adversely affected, even if they're, especially if they're living in swing states, even if those swing states have ballot initiatives, I think that case could be made more forcefully. And I think this is already an issue that voters care a lot about, and I think they will care even more if they understand the stakes.
Are you surprised that JD Vance and the cat lady, childless cat lady comment has become so big? I mean, what does that say to you that that has caused so much outrage? He said that comment a couple years ago. I guess he doubled down on it too when he was asked about it. But why does that have so many legs, so to speak?
You want to go ahead, Dahlia?
Well, I mean, I think, first of all, it signals just where we are in this campaign, that, you know, these kind of memes and jokes and the weird thing and the cat lady thing and the couch thing. I mean, it really is, we're in such a strange new world of almost giddy, you know, almost drunken hopium on the part of Democrats who have this new energy and kind of goofiness that was all but missing, right, a month ago. And I think we're still a little bit in that stage. But I think at the more serious level, what JD Vance has embraced, and this is really part and parcel of Project 2025, which, you know, we should talk about at some point, just because I think it is the template for how to think about reproductive rights and families and the rights of women and all of these issues that are kind of under the surface of the reproductive rights conversation, but really, really not apt to say the quiet parts loud unless you read all 900 pages of Project 2025 and really kind of see the ways in which this is an attempt to reinstantiate a sort of man-centered, you know, woman subordinate, you know, many, many children, all under God family. I mean, there's a clear vision here of how the United States wants to return to some kind of halcyon days of where the dads were in charge and there was no LGBTQ rights and women stayed home and there's no fault divorce, right? All of that is there. And I think JD Vance, in surfacing these ideas about, you know, the necessity for women to marry and have children and to have many children and to stay home with them, I mean, that was just him saying the quiet part out loud. In some sense, I think the cat lady, you know, childless women was a way of saying the quiet part out loud, and now he has to live with it. In some sense, I think that Trump and Vance running away from Project 2025 and the Heritage Foundation and some of the, you know, cornerstones of what it is that they say they want to do if Trump is reelected is all mushed into that fight about childless cat ladies.
Even though he is married to a Stanford law graduate himself, and who is
Yale Law, right? I think, is she Yale? Yeah.
Maybe she taught at Stanford. Anyway, something. Anyway, she is very.
Stanford is awesome for people on the call. We're not trashing
Stanford. Very well.
Or Yale. Nobody's trashing.
Yale's great too. It's all good.
It's all great. Anyway, the point being that she's a professional woman, not childless, but still a professional woman. And so this idea of sending women back into the home to take care of the men, it's sort of belied by his actual real life experience. So I guess, is he saying this stuff for real, or is he saying it to cater to the base? And given what, Mary, we just talked about in terms of the success of the midterms, how smart is that as a campaign tactic?
Well, I mean, I think, well, first of all, Vance wasn't saying this now, right? I mean, what Trump's abortion strategy has been to confuse everyone, right? So Trump's abortion strategy has been to say, I'm for states' rights, but I'm also sort of for fetal personhood. And I'm may or may not treat this old obscenity law as an abortion. And it's sort of to pretend to be all things to all people. And I think at the time he picked Vance, the assumption was that he could literally have picked, me or Dahlia, and he would have been elected anyway. So it didn't matter if Vance had lots of skeletons in the closet and had said lots of things about childless cat ladies, because Trump felt so confident he was going to win that there was no, whatever downside came with JD Vance wasn't going to be consequential. And I think obviously now the election and the race in general are in a very different place, and all of these things about Vance that Trump either knew or should have known are appearing differently in terms of how they may affect the race. And I think one of the interesting things about it too is that the childless cat lady comments seem to offend not just progressive women and men, but other people too, because there are a non-trivial number of conservative women who've had struggles with fertility, or who don't want to have children, or who just never found the right partner, or who prioritize their careers as well as their families. And so I think it's this sort of comment that rubbed a lot of people the wrong way, even in some of parts of Trump's potential base. So I think at the time JD Vance was saying it, it was to, gin up support on the far right, which has been where JD Vance has sort of plied his trade since getting elected to the Senate. Although, as you point out, I don't know how many of us really believe that that's what JD Vance believes when he's home with his family, but that's been kind of his political bread and butter for a while. So I think it's mostly a function of how I don't think that was wise. I don't think anyone thinks it was wise, but I think Trump had sort of saddled himself with Vance, and now all of this stuff is coming out. And instead of in other words, it's much easier to distance yourself from Project 2025 if you're Trump than it is to distance yourself from Vance, other than insofar as Vance himself has embraced Project 2025, of course.
And written the introduction to the Heritage
Mhm.
Foundation's leader's new book. So can we get into the Project 2025? I don't know if you've read all 900 pages, Dahlia. Did you? Or
No, I wish I could say I've read all 900 pages. I mean, I think, and probably Mary has read even more closely than I, the stuff that I have focused on has been the material on reproductive rights, on women's rights, on family. And maybe, I'll leave it to Mary to maybe summarize what the agenda is. I will say, I think one thing we've slightly missed about Project 2025, and this has just become a subject of real concern for me, is that as Trump and Vance back away from Project 2025, and they sort of say, oh, that was never, embraced by the GOP, and we don't know, we have no idea who even wrote that, and we don't know where that's come from. I just want to point out that every single major prong of Project 2025 has actually already been put into effect by the US Supreme Court. And I just think we kind of have this very binary view of, if Trump wins, yes, Project 2025, if he loses, it goes away. And to the extent that the three kind of pillars of Project 2025 are massive deregulation, that was the Chevron case this year, that was the EPA case this year. Another prong was massive accrual of power to the executive branch, right? Bolstering an incredibly strong, quote unquote, unitary executive. That was the immunity decision this year. And then the third prong is really, really breathing life into this kind of Christian nationalist, right-wing religious worldview. And that has been, a slow progress at the Supreme Court over the past 2 decades. So the one thing I want to say, just as a framing matter about Project 2025, even before you get to the repro question, is that the US Supreme Court is well on its way to making Project 2025 a thing. And regardless of who wins this election, I think that we have to focus on those 3 pillars of what Project 2025 seeks out to do writ large, and understand that's already in motion. That's not going away, whoever wins the election. So I like to say that, because I think we tend to think that if Kamala Harris wins, Project 2025 vaporizes. That's simply not the case. We're already living in the world of Project 2025, thanks to the Roberts Court.
Wow. Okay, well, I definitely want to get into that, into the court in just a moment. But Mary, first, do you want to add anything when it comes?
Yeah. So the kind of what is the game plan for reproductive rights in Project 2025? Again, it's also sort of the game plan of J.D. Vance. So the centerpiece of it is the Comstock Act, which is a 19th century obscenity law. If you do Control F in Project 2025, the word Comstock Act does not appear. But if you want to verify this, the site in the U.S. Code for the Comstock Act, which is 18 USC 1461 and 1462, those both do appear. That's what they're talking about. So the Comstock Act, as some of you may remember, was an obscenity law that banned the mailing of a lot of things that were deemed to be for indecent or immoral use. The preoccupation of Anthony Comstock, the guy after whom the law was named, was pretty much what he saw as illicit sex. So he traveled around with a bag of sex toys and so on. So he was only concerned with contraception and abortion, which he considered indistinguishable insofar as they allowed people to conceal the consequences of illicit sex, right? So he wanted people, saw pregnancy as a punishment for having the kind of sex he didn't think you should have. Anti-abortion lawyers rediscovered the Comstock Act and now argue that it's essentially a ban on mailing any abortion-related item or information, and as a consequence is a de facto abortion ban, full stop, because there are no abortions that take place in the United States without some item that is sent through UPS or USPS or FedEx or whatever. So the Project 2025 takes up this argument. It cites pretty broad language from the Comstock Act and then calls on what would be a Trump administration to prioritize the prosecution of doctors and drug companies, although the Comstock Act, as conservatives interpret it, would also apply to people who receive abortion-related items and information in the mail, including women, right? So this is not just a sort of like, the medical industrial complex kind of prosecutions. It would potentially be much broader than that. There's a general preoccupation beyond the Comstock Act, which appears in multiple parts of Project 2025. There's also a preoccupation with a medication abortion. There's a call on a Trump Food and Drug Administration to either withdraw mifepristone, which is a drug used in more than half of all U.S. abortions, from the market, or to reimpose restrictions that would eliminate a telehealth option for medication abortion. There's some hints that maybe that would be done either by transforming the FDA. As many of you know, the architects of Project 2025 are hoping to kind of restaff much of the federal government with Trump loyalists. There's also hints that if that isn't possible, given with career scientists at FDA, that maybe the Secretary of Health and Human Services could override what scientists at FDA are doing. And there's even some thought, there's some detail about what contraceptive policy should look like too. Project 2025 in general, unsurprisingly, sort of shifts the focus of contraceptive policy away from contraception and toward abstinence-only sex education, and also makes a move that I think you're going to see increasingly made by conservatives, which is to say that contraception and abortion are indistinguishable. So Project 2025 primarily takes this step vis-a-vis emergency contraception, which it calls the week after pill, as a pun on the morning after pill, which is what most of us use as in referring to emergency contraception, and say that emergency contraceptives should no longer be considered as part of contraceptive programs like the contraceptive mandate of the Affordable Care Act. So it's a pretty broad agenda, but the kind of biggest takeaway, right, is that if you are in Michigan, Minnesota, California, whatever, the Project 2025 is saying Trump's Justice Department can prosecute your doctor or a drug company or you for receiving abortion pills in the mail, no matter what your state constitution has to say about abortion rights. And that can happen on day one. And that's not just Project 2025. J.D. Vance was one of a group of senators who wrote a letter to the Justice Department saying, this is what the Comstock Act means. It applies everywhere. It overrides whatever your state is doing. And I mean, I think that's a message that Kamala Harris could, say more forcefully, just because I don't think people understand that there are no safe havens necessarily in a second Trump administration. There's no sort of like, well, I voted for this ballot initiative and I'm good. That's not the world we live in anymore.
So again, this is something that's already, this 1873 law is already on the
Yes.
book. It just
Right.
would mean.
Yeah, and that's the key to this strategy. Project 2025, as Dahlia says, relies on a combination of the conservative federal judiciary and executive power, because essentially everyone who wrote Project 2025 knows that Congress is never going to pass a ban on abortion at fertilization that contains no exceptions, that criminalizes women and other pregnant people. It's just like, that's never going to happen. And so they had to reinvent this 19th century obscenity law that's already on the books to be that, even though that's not what it is, because that's the only way they can get what they want, essentially to kind of go around the will of the voters. But it's a real threat, because all you need for this strategy to work is for a Trump Justice Department to agree with the theory, and for this conservative supermajority on the Supreme Court to agree with the theory. And that's a lot more likely than the American people agreeing with that kind of outcome.
How
And,
different?
and just one beat on that also, which is, I think that Mary's point is so important, which is there are a lot of people walking around the country who are behaving as though Comstock is still good law. And I think it's really important to understand that it is nothing magical has to happen in order to start to invoke Comstock. In fact, Matthew Kaczmarek, the judge in Texas, who's, tried to take mifepristone off the market nationwide, relied on Comstock as though it is existing binding good law. And at oral argument, that came up. There were justices who were behaving as though Comstock somehow had a role in deciding this case. And so I think it's another one of these zombie laws, right? Very much like we have seen around the country, breathing life into old statutes and saying, oh, this was always still good law. And so nothing has to happen to trigger Comstock. I think it's important to understand that Project 2025 begins from the assumption that Comstock never went away. It's still binding good law. And the first day in office, Donald Trump and his Justice Department would begin to behave that way. And so I think just, to flick at something Mary said before, Congress needs to pass nothing to make this happen. You could just by fiat say this was, a loaded gun lying around on the table, and now we're going to use it. And so I think we have to be very, very careful about, and by the way, there have been efforts to really revoke Comstock that have failed. In other words, there are ways to make sure it's gone. It's not going to live again. But I don't think any of us should be sanguine about the possibility that, Comstock is just gone. It's only gone for those of us who, haven't heard of it yet.
And it's not that it wouldn't be that easy to repeal it, right? Because it would, first of all, you'd need, I guess, Democratic majorities in both houses and in the White House, but also filibuster-proof majorities.
Yeah. I mean, and I think, right, and it's not going to happen before the election. So I mean, and I don't think there's even been a political mobilization to repeal it. I mean, I think if you had, I mean, that's an interesting question. If Kamala Harris was elected, how much of a priority Comstock repeal would be? I think, but there need to be a build to that, because I think there's a good amount of polling suggesting that Americans who know what the Comstock Act could mean are horrified by it, and that almost no one knows what the Comstock Act would mean, which is not a recipe for repeal, right? There's like zero pressure on members of Congress to do anything about this right now, because it's not on the front burner for most people.
Dahlia, you mentioned the Kaczmarek case of mifepristone, and the court did, when it worked its way up to the court, they unanimously upheld the FDA's ability to regulate mifepristone, but they did so based on standing, as far as I understand. So basically saying they rejected the case because the plaintiffs did not prove that they were adversely affected by this. So that seems like a thin leg to stand on in the future. Are there any other cases working their way up through the system that would the court would look more favorably upon when it comes to saying that the FDA could not regulate mifepristone?
I think, Madeleine, I might gently reframe the holding in that case. I don't think the court actually made any claims about the FDA's ability to regulate mifepristone. I think the court simply made a decision on standing, that these are the wrong plaintiffs in this case, a clutch of doctors and dentists who did not want to perform any sort of emergency medical care on somebody who had taken mifepristone. And, the idea that that was too attenuated to show a cognizable harm for standing purposes does not mean this case doesn't come back with real plaintiffs that do have standing. And in fact, already we have states who have jumped into the same case who say we actually have standing as states under our sort of parens patriae state rights to make sure that everybody is safe. And so we already have a roadmap for standing from the Kaczmarek case that may come back to the court. And I want to say both that case, which I think will come back to the court with more credible plaintiffs who do have credible claims of standing, and the EMTALA case, the other big abortion case that the court, again, sort of kind of kicked away at the very end of the term and said, oh, whoops, we intervened too early in the second abortion case that just had to do with, the Biden administration had sort of tightened up after Dobbs had said that emergency medical stabilizing treatment under EMTALA includes abortion care, some things that might be deemed abortion care, even broader than whatever a state would have prevented, right? That case also does not end. It just gets kicked away. And the court essentially said, the technical word is that was, the court digs it, which means it's kicked away as improvidently granted. That case is also coming back to the US Supreme Court. And so I think this is a sort of a trick that looks as though the court gave two big wins to abortion rights this term. Actually, it gave a push in both cases and gave a roadmap to coming back and successfully bringing both those cases. The EMTALA case, the second case, is already, I think, very, very likely to be at the court again this term. And so I just think we sometimes have this misapprehension that the court has given a big win to abortion rights when the court just decided in both of those cases not to decide, but gave very clear directives about how to win next time when it's not an election year with a topic that is clearly galvanizing voters. So I think I'll stop there if Mary wants to know what else is coming up on the docket.
Yeah, I mean, there's the possibility, kind of outside possibility, of some cases involving abortion-related travel coming to the court. There are cases, so some of you may be familiar with Idaho's abortion trafficking law that prohibits anyone from helping a minor travel out of state for abortion, even to places where abortion rights are protected, without parental consent. There's litigation about that law that's proceeding through the lower courts. The upcoming is a case involving Steve Marshall, the Attorney General of Alabama, who had suggested that he could prosecute people for conspiracy for planning to help someone else travel to a state where abortion is legal. He was in turn sued by an abortion fund, saying he did not have that authority, seeking a declaratory judgment essentially to say he can't do that. He doesn't have the power to do that. That's in court too. So we're beginning to see bubble up these questions about, what happens when the states are in conflict with one another? And this is just the tip of the iceberg here. Some of you may know that in many of the states in which you live, there are so-called shield doctors who are mailing pills from their jurisdictions to states where abortion is illegal. Thousands of these a month, at least, likely more. And what do you do with the legality of that, right? Because the state doing the mailing says, well, there's no crime here. This is a protected right for us in our state. The banned state says, well, it is a crime here, and we want to apply our laws. So question number one is whose law applies? Question number two is, if one state's law or the other applies, does that violate some part of the Constitution, whether that's due process, whether that's the right to travel, there's like an extradition clause, like there's a whole bunch of stuff that's going to end up at the US Supreme Court too. I think, again, anti-abortion groups have been holding fire a little bit on going after some of these doctors because they don't want to do it before an election. But I think when the election is over, we're likely to see these sort of civil wars between the states arrive in the federal courts too. We're already seeing some of these cases, and some of them may well end up before the court too, in addition to the mifepristone and EMTALA cases, maybe not as quickly, but I think that's inevitable. And the Comstock question too, because to Dahlia's point, the mifepristone case was not just about FDA authority, it was also about the Comstock Act. The anti-abortion groups in that case essentially said, well, the FDA didn't have the authority to permit telehealth abortion because the Comstock Act makes it a crime to mail abortion pills. So that was teed up in part as an opportunity for the Supreme Court to signal that it thought that the Comstock Act was an abortion ban, to give a Republican administration a green light to start enforcing it as such. So that claim could well be back before the court in short order too. So I think all of those things are things to watch.
When
May
you're talking,
I say one other, can I say one other thing, Madeleine, that I think is sort of undergirding this conversation, but I want to say it really explicitly, and Mary's thought about this and written about this better than anyone, but I think it's also really important for framing these conversations to understand that it's not only a question of what is legal and what is not legal, and that we get very, very tangled up in which states have criminalized and at what week, the ban is, and what is emergency care and what are the exceptions. And I just think it's really important to center in this conversation that that's secondary. The actual point is confusion and chaos, right? Which is something that I think doesn't get talked about nearly enough by lawyers on these kinds of conversations. And if you just look at what's happening in Texas, right, where you have physicians who are afraid to provide emergency medical care, right? You have Amanda Zarowski, you have Kate Cox, you have story after story of people who are in states where maybe they're eligible for an exemption to the state ban, but we don't know. And if physicians are afraid, or as we are now seeing, physicians are fleeing states rather than, risk their licensure or risk, crippling fines for performing emergency medical care, it almost doesn't matter what the law is. And so I think that for me, the beating heart of this conversation isn't always like, what is legal, what isn't legal, what did the Supreme Court allow, what didn't it allow, what did the state Supreme Court allow, what did it not allow? It is the fact that if you have physicians who are chilled from providing medical care, right? I mean, standard of practice medical care, and are either leaving state so that you have abortion deserts, or are too afraid, right? They're on the phone with the lawyer and the hospital board, and somebody is bleeding out, right, in the parking lot. That's the thing I want to really, really focus on, because I think that part of this post-Dobbs world is creating such massive confusion and fear that physicians don't know what the right thing is. And that we are seeing, and that's not a case that's going to come to the Supreme Court per se. That is the actual, not just effect of Dobbs, I think that's the desired outcome of Dobbs, which is fostering fear and confusion among practitioners. And we are seeing that absolutely everywhere in the country. And I don't think that that gets resolved unless we have, in a Harris administration, a meaningful kind of re-upping of what it is to protect reproductive rights.
so that you just teed up my next question, because I was wondering if all of these cases and all of this confusion is moot if there is a national law passed that protects abortion rights. Is that something that could make all of these cases go away? The EMTALA case, the mifepristone case, the shield laws, all of that, could that just go away if there were a national law protecting abortion rights up to a certain time, or what have you?
I mean, I can take that no. I mean, so the people like, I mean, again, like, I mean, I'm a legal historian and Dahlia's a reporter. So while we're both lawyers, that means we're sort of like nihilists too, right? Like the historians are always the nihilists. And like in law school, people are like, let's talk about doctrine. And I'm like, bro, it's all politics all the way down. So I'm here to tell you that if they passed, okay, first of all, number one, I don't think Congress is going to pass a law protecting reproductive rights. If, we wake up in 2024 or 2026 in a very different world than the one in which we currently live, and that becomes possible, the Supreme Court may well strike it down, right? Because there's going to be all kinds of litigation from the anti-abortion movement about whether Congress, in fact, has the authority to pass such legislation. There are, as someone who studies the anti-abortion movement, there are already strategies teed up to do that, as unlikely as it is that that would be something that Congress actually does. And then, of course, there's the question of interpreting such a law. In the very unlikely event that the U.S. Supreme Court said that such a law was constitutional, it would be the same U.S. Supreme Court charged with interpreting the law. So I think, again, there's a scenario where a federal law could make a difference, but that would also depend on changes to the court, right? And that in and of itself may be incrementally less far-fetched, because the two most elderly justices are the two most conservative justices, Clarence Thomas and Samuel Alito. And I don't think we're talking enough about how the Supreme Court's composition could potentially, not necessarily, but potentially change in the next 4 years. So that's something else that's on the ballot. There's like a 0% chance that Clarence Thomas and Samuel Alito would retire if Kamala Harris was the president. But, once you're into your mid-70s, there are health crises and other imperatives that may force you to retire, even if you would rather not. But I don't think there's kind of a silver bullet in a federal statute with the court as currently constituted.
Which raises the issue of Biden's proposal, which Mike Johnson said is DOA, but one of them is to limit one of his proposals was to limit the terms to 18 years, I believe. Do you think that that's at all doable?
I mean, certainly not doable before the election. It would require both houses and, again, a filibuster-proof supermajority, in addition to which I think there's at least a plausible claim that one of the three fixes, which is creating term limits, might be unconstitutional, right? If you can serve for life under the terms of the Constitution, then you have to really kind of navigate. I mean, the proposal is that you will rotate justices off after 18 years so that they're not retired, they're still serving, which happens. Justice Souter still serves on the appeals courts. So it's doable, but I do think there are obviously constitutional questions. I will say, and I have snarkily said before, with respect to the proposals to reform the court, which is, ethics reform, mandatory, and not kind of optional. I feel like ethics reform, term limits, and a constitutional amendment that would get rid of the immunity decision. Those are the three prongs. I have slightly snarkily said in the past, Madeleine, that I hope President Biden invents the DeLorean to go back in time and do this so that, it would forestall what has happened. In other words, it is so too late to be having this conversation. But I do think it
would be an RV, not a DeLorean.
Right. Well, a DeLorean bought and paid for by Harlan Crow. Yeah. But I will say, I think that the point of this is to have the conversation about court reform. It's not to do court reform. It's to inject into, the left an urgency around the court that has not existed in my entire, 25 years covering the court, and very much exists on the other side, right? I mean, that was the prime mover of voters who pulled the lever for Donald Trump in 2016 by a 2-to-1 margin. They prioritized the court and they said, we don't particularly care for this guy, but he's going to give us the court. And he did. So I think that the real impulse here is not to do any of these three forms of court reform. And I would also add the easiest thing is, believe it or not, adding 4 seats to the court, which is not, we started by talking about how small c conservative President Biden is. That's not on the table. It's not something he has raised as a court reform, but I will say adding seats is the easiest fix to this. But I think the whole purpose is to have a conversation about if by 75%, polling suggests Americans want term limits, 75%, they want to have mandatory enforced ethics rules. I think it's a way of running against the court that is very, very long overdue. And for the people who hate Dobbs, who hate Bruen, who hate the Chevron decision, who hate the immunity decision, it's a way of connecting the conversation about the presidential election. The thing that Mary said, there are, 2 vulnerable seats. Vote on that. And we have really failed to message that until now. And I think it's an effort to do that.
Okay, let me get to some questions. Anatole asks, if the Comstock Act is used to override state abortion laws, what happens when a state such as California refuses to comply? What happens if a groundswell of citizens refuses to comply? In other words, I guess mailing mifepristone anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I can answer the question from history, because you'll be unsurprised to learn that people never really complied with the Comstock. I mean, especially because back in the day, the Comstock Act was applied to, like, hey, are you studying to be a doctor? Guess what? There are naked people in your book and that you're going to jail. The most ridiculous example of this was that people enforcing the Comstock Act tried to prosecute other enforcers of the Comstock Act for fundraising about arresting people for mailing things, because they're like, you used the word contraception in a fundraiser and that's obscene, so we're coming for you too. And they're like, wait, we're your colleagues. Why are you arresting us? So it was ridiculous, and people always resisted. What tended to happen was, as is often the case with unenforceable laws, that there were show trials and selective prosecutions of people who were big targets. And that's what I would expect here too. So I would expect to see a Trump Justice Department, make an example of, a Planned Parenthood or a prominent Shield doctor or someone who's a big fish, to get the kind of chilling effect that Dahlia was describing, right? Like, the point of having the Comstock Act enforced is not that every single person getting mifepristone in the mail is going to face federal prosecution and up to 5 years in prison. That's just not workable. How would you even know, right? I mean, you still need a warrant to get into people's mail. It would instead, I think, the idea would be to have enough prosecutions of big name enough entities such that everyone else was afraid, and maybe then unwilling to protest against the Comstock Act. Reva Siegel and Yale and I did a piece about the history of the Comstock Act. That's essentially a history of how people fought the Comstock Act, and eventually its enforcement died down and it was reinterpreted by judges. So that's very much a possibility. And if we end up in a world, if we have another, if the 3 of us are together again after the election and Trump has won, that's probably what we're going to be looking at. But I think you always see selective enforcement, and you also see some sort of Salem witch trials-esque people turning one another in. We've already seen in the abortion conflict lots of kind of bounty hunting. There's a history of that in the Comstock Act too. There's a history of people who are mad at each other because, their relationships have gone sour, or they're mad at their politics, or they don't like their neighbors, of turning one another in, right? Essentially reporting on people violating the Comstock Act. So there are a lot of dystopian things we'd expect to see. We wouldn't expect to see most people who are violating it getting in trouble, but a groundswell of resistance might be kind of what would be necessary to get rid of it, if that's in fact the world we end up in.
And can I add, I'm gonna be this guy again, but I want to make one other point about Comstock that I think both Mary and I have sort of said, but I want to say really expressly, which is there's a part of Comstock, if not actually Comstock itself, which really goes after speech itself. And there's an important First Amendment component here. And in fact, part of the reason that we believe that Comstock was dead was because so many of the First Amendment cases in the last century that protected speech, that protected porn, that protected obscenity, that protected putting things in the mail were really about throttling Comstock. And the part of Comstock that is very scary is the part that would criminalize, as Mary said, what is pure speech, whether it is advocacy, right? Whether it is, this is how you do it, putting into the mails information, journalism itself, right, could be swept up in that. And so I think there is a way in which the massive overbreadth of Comstock really does start to sweep in speech and advocacy, and very, very protected political speech and advocacy. And so I think that's a place we have to think about really pushing back. And I think I also want to say, as part of the gentle reframe here, that, Mary talks about sort of bounty hunting. And I think it's important to remember this. So much of the Dobbs world starts not with Dobbs, but SB 8 in Texas, which is the, the aiding and abetting statute that lets you, turn somebody in because they drove somebody in an Uber to a clinic. And I just want to really re-up the idea, because it's so important, that in addition to sowing confusion that we talked about and uncertainty on the part of providers, one of the objectives here is to isolate people who most need help and advice and advocacy, and who most need somebody safe to talk to and to go to. And if you say anybody who tells somebody who is vulnerable and afraid, here are your options, here's where you can go to, here's a website, that's a way of absolutely terrifying and isolating the people who are most vulnerable at the moment at which they most need help. And so this sort of like First Amendment speech component of Comstock, but also of these bounty laws, are something we have to think about really rigorously, because what we are doing when we fail to protect that kind of speech is isolating people who are going to be helped by that speech at the moment that they are most alone in the world.
Yeah, and really quickly too, the Comstock Act's language, it's still an obscenity law, right? So we're all here pretending it's an abortion ban. The other reason this is consequential is that there's, like, the Comstock Act says you can't mail other items for indecent or immoral use. I don't know what that means, right? Does that mean you can't email drugs for HIV prophylaxis? Does that mean you can't mail sex toys? Does that mean you can't mail drugs for gender affirming care? Does that mean you can't mail the morning after pill because it's secretly an abortifacient? Does it mean you can't mail material on sex education that recognizes the existence of people who aren't straight? Like, we don't have any idea, because this is, to Dahlia's point, there's all kinds of First Amendment problems with it. It's really vague, but it's all still on the books. So if the Comstock Act is revived, the endpoint is not going to be just abortion and reproductive rights. There's a lot of other stuff that could be on the table down the line too.
And why wasn't it revived in the first Trump administration?
Because it would have been unconstitutional under Roe, and because it would have been disastrously politically unpopular. And I'm doing a whole book about this, like why the anti-abortion movement is willing to take on the baggage of the Comstock Act, which is essentially admitting, it's the quiet part out loud, as Dahlia was saying. It's saying, Anthony Comstock was the symbol of Victorian sexual prudery, and we're embracing that. Like, we're okay with the fact that this is about gender roles. They weren't okay with that in 2016. They weren't okay with taking on that baggage, and now they are. And that tells you a lot about how the politics have changed.
Okay. Let's see. We have so many questions. Okay. Can Congress impeach a Supreme Court justice, and on what grounds? Good question.
High crimes and misdemeanors. It's an incredibly high bar, and it's so high. I mean, if you think about the attempts to impeach President Trump for much more lawless activity, whether it was the first or the second impeachment, accepting lavish fishing trips just does not even come close. So I don't think this is impeachable. I will say, and I always remind people, Abe Fortas was ousted from the court by his own colleagues and his own Chief Justice, who was a liberal, who knew he was giving a seat to Richard Nixon by pushing Fortas off the court for what, $20,000 compared to the luxury RV and to the vacation and the, godnephew's tuition and the mother's house. I mean, the kinds of things for which Abe Fortas was not impeached, but removed by his own colleagues from the court. really, I think, raises the question of what it is that John Roberts has allowed to happen on his watch. The idea that something that was relatively trivial compared to what we're seeing now in terms of ethical misconduct, a failure to report, a failure to recuse. And it really, to me, shows where the court has moved since the 1960s, when it was animated by a deep, deep concern for public legitimacy. And Fortis's activities were seen as disqualifying. And here we are, many orders of magnitude worse misconduct, and just shrugged away by the Chief Justice, and no attempt by the other justices to reckon with that. So I think impeachment is not the answer, but I do think that the sort of systems failure here is at the court itself.
Can you talk about whether you expect these justices and this current court to take on other, what we once thought were inviolable rights, such as protecting interracial marriage or access to contraception, given the argument in Dobbs that was made to justify overturning Roe, that there is no protection in the Constitution for a right to privacy. And so then could Dobbs be used then to overturn those previous decisions that we thought were ironclad?
I mean, it could. I think so. I mean, I'd be the most worried about same-sex marriage and same-sex intimacy and sort of contraception. Contraception is a complicated one, right? Because on the one hand, there is no groundswell of like anti-contraception movement as there is an anti-abortion movement. On the other hand, every state, or the vast majority of states, including Virginia, that have tried to pass right to contraception bills have failed because there's concerted opposition to right to contraception bills, just as there is concerted opposition in Congress. I think that's a longer term project, reversal of the right to contraception. There's groundwork being laid for it in a couple of different ways. I think most likely the first thing we're going to see is pushback against the idea that minors can access contraception. There's already litigation to that effect, in front of our friend Matthew Kaczmarek and the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. There's also a kind of incremental effort to build the case that contraceptives aren't safe, and that therefore women and other pregnant people or people who can get pregnant at least, need to be protected from them. I think certainly doctrinally, right, Dobbs, if you're being intellectually honest, there cannot be either Dobbs is not what it says it is in terms of how it understands history and tradition, or there is no right to contraception. There's it was precisely at the moment in time that Dobbs purports to care about that the first criminal laws against contraception, including the Comstock Act, which was, I think, actually one of the first, that was precisely when those laws were being introduced. So if you think the existence of criminal law means you can't have a right, there's no right to contraception. I think it's just a question of whether the court, is, if there are bridges too far in terms of doing things that are politically unpopular, when there aren't organized movements as effectively pushing for the demolition of those rights as there was with Roe. I think there are concerns about same-sex marriage too, of course, because the conservative Christian legal movement's never given up on getting rid of access to same-sex marriage. I think that too is a longer-term project. The most imminent threat, I think, from what I've seen, is that conservatives are trying to recharacterize contraceptives as abortion and say they don't need to reverse this court's precedents on contraception because they can just apply existing criminal abortion bans to criminalize contraception. So that may trigger a challenge based on the idea of a right to contraception sooner, but that would be what I would expect to see the most quickly, other than minors and conscientious refusals to serve people seeking contraception.
Dahlia, did you want to add on to that?
No, I think Mary's exactly right, that the thing that is stopping the court from doing that is the court. Doctrinally, there is everything that is in the bucket of substantive due process that falls when Roe falls. Everything is on the table, which is why Justice Thomas's concurrence in Dobbs was essentially a sort of laundry list of, to do, like we're going after this, this, and this. Curiously absent from that list actually was Loving versus Virginia, the anti-miscegenation case, partly because it's protected under equal protection and not just substantive due process. But I will say that there was one case this term that sent up a flare to people who are closely watching the court, and that is for people who have a non-citizen spouse. And the court was incredibly cavalier about those rights in ways that led Justice Sotomayor to write a real red flag, sort of 5-alarm dissent, saying Obergefell, the marriage equality case, is in the crosshairs if the court can be this cavalier about the definition of marriage. So I think that signaled to some of us that the court is probably willing, as Mary says, to think about marriage equality as the next frontier.
All right. And your predictions for this election, do you think that, I mean, it's impossible to know what's going to happen, of course, but from what you're looking at and your analysis, do you think that the Democrats now have a chance of keeping the White House, regaining the House, keeping the Senate, and having a trifecta again? Dahlia?
I mean, I will say this, and I wrote a book about this, so obviously I have some skin in the game. But in every single state in which women had the opportunity to put abortion on the ballot, abortion won, and won by big margins, including in ruby red states like Kansas, right? So we know that abortion, not just in the midterms, but at the state level and at state Supreme Court, right? In Wisconsin. I mean, we know that this is an animating issue. And I think it is going to be really, really essential. And Mary and I have both said this in different ways, to have that conversation, to really have the conversation about what it means, particularly for women, to be facing losing the kind of hard-fought gains of the past century. Do I think that you can get a trifecta? I think that the system is working exactly as intended, and that means that the Senate is malapportioned by design, the Electoral College is broken by design, vote suppression is happening by design, the Voting Rights Act is not operative by design. In other words, a democracy that was born to suppress certain rights in order to make sure that white landholding men had a thumb on the scale continues to work toward that end. And so I think that really the work is going to be perfecting democracy so that every single system that exists in order to decrease the franchise increases it. That requires thinking about the Electoral College reform, Senate reform, voting reform, gerrymandering, all the stuff that makes our eyes glaze over at the end of this kind of conversation. That structural democracy work is going to be the necessary precursor to having the kind of democracy that reflects what people actually want.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, right? So my longer term, and I've said this too, and this is the nihilist coming out. I think that when democracy is healthy, abortion rights win, right? And so to me, the story of Dobbs, and I've written about this, is a story about how you can jerry-rig a result that doesn't reflect the will of the people, right? And how you can create a court that isn't responsive to the fact that people don't like what the court is doing, which was not historically true. It wasn't when I was in law school, there were books we would read saying like the court is the most responsive to voters, right? The court doesn't want to trigger backlash. That's not our court anymore, right? So I think it will depend on if the result of the election, I think it will depend on if people understand how important this election is to abortion rights, which I'm not sure is the case right now, and whether Kamala Harris can, make that case to voters in a way they understand. And then two, I think it'll depend on if the election then reflects what people want or not, right? Which isn't a guarantee in our democracy, which has been ailing in some ways for some time and continues to. So I think, reproductive rights in that way are kind of the canary in the coal mine, right? So I think that we have to see how healthy our democracy is. There's a stress test happening now, and we'll all find out the results, in November.
Well, hopefully we'll have you both back after then to have another great and fascinating conversation. Thank you both so much for being with us this hour. I really appreciate it, Dahlia Lithwick and Mary Ziegler.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you so much. Take care, everyone.
Bye. And thank you so much for being with us. Be back with us on Monday when David Frum will be here with Pat Morrison. Bye-bye.